Chicago in 2002 was a city that lived in constant contrast. Towering skyscrapers reflected polished sunlight by day, but by night, entire neighborhoods shifted into something else. Streets of neon and shadow, alive with music, arguments, and the unshakable feeling that anything could happen. Belmont and Clark was one of those corners, a place where bars and nightclubs lured crowds, even as locals whispered about thefts, fights, and disappearances that were too easily forgotten. That April night, 19-year-old Michael Turner walked into one of those clubs with friends. He wasn't the kind of teenager who belonged to the chaos. Michael lived at home with his parents, worked part-time at a hardware store, and took evening classes at a local community college. His friends described him as steady, reliable, sometimes too careful. He wasn't a drinker, he didn't chase trouble, and he was the kind of son who called his mom if he was running late. Inside the club, the music was loud, the kind that rattled through the thin walls and bled out onto the street. Michael laughed at his friends' stories and smiled when people teased him for never dancing. But underneath, he seemed distracted. One friend remembered him checking his watch again and again. Another recalled him glancing toward the door as if waiting for someone who never arrived. When the group asked if he was all right, he waved them off with a half smile. "Just tired," he said. Around 1:30 a.m., Michael stood up. "See you tomorrow," he told his friends, before walking outside into the damp spring night. The street was quieter now, but not silent. A taxi idled down the block. Streetlights flickered against the mist that clung to the sidewalk. Across the corner, a freestanding ATM glowed faintly beneath a broken bulb. Michael buttoned his jacket and walked toward it. A security camera, mounted above a nearby shop, captured him at 1:40 a.m. The footage was typical of early 2000s surveillance, grainy, blurred, the kind that turned faces into shadows. But the shape of Michael was unmistakable. He walked toward the ATM, the light reflecting off his jacket. The camera never recorded him leaving. By sunrise, Ellen Turner realized something was wrong. Her son's bed was untouched. His phone went straight to voicemail. At first, she tried to believe he had stayed at a friend's place, but Michael never ignored her calls. She drove the streets that morning, retraced the route between the club and their home, checked diners, bus stops, and gas stations. Nothing. By afternoon, she and her husband Robert filed a missing person report. Detectives asked the routine questions. Was he depressed? Did he have enemies? Was he in debt? The family shook their heads. Michael wasn't reckless, wasn't troubled, and had no reason to vanish. That made his sudden disappearance harder to explain. Then came the detail that stood out. Records showed that the ATM Michael had walked toward had been serviced that very night. A technician from a third-party company had logged into the system just minutes before Michael appeared on camera. Police questioned him once. He was polite, calm, and explained he had been performing routine maintenance, swapped a part, checked the system, locked the machine, and left. He insisted he saw nothing unusual. On paper, there was nothing to contradict him. And yet, within weeks, that man left Chicago completely. For Ellen and Robert, the coincidence was unbearable. Their son had walked toward an ATM that, at that exact moment, was in the hands of a stranger with complete access to its hidden compartments. And then Michael was gone. Flyers went up across the neighborhood within days. Robert stapled them to telephone poles until his hands blistered. Ellen spent nights calling hospitals, shelters, anywhere that might have taken in a young man without ID. Volunteers helped distribute posters. Friends organized vigils. And for a brief time, Michael's face stared back from every bus stop and storefront window. But leads evaporated as quickly as they came. Witnesses who thought they saw him were wrong. Tips dried up. The city moved on. Inside the Turner home, silence replaced hope. Ellen refused to pack up Michael's belongings. His sneakers remained by the door, his school notebooks stacked on his desk. She left his bedroom door open at night, telling herself that maybe he would walk back through it, quietly, as if nothing had happened. Robert grew quieter, burying his grief in work by day and pacing the house at night. Weeks passed, then months. The ATM on Belmont and Clark continued to glow, its screen lighting up the faces of countless strangers. People lined up casually, inserting cards, withdrawing bills, walking away without a second thought. To them, it was just a machine. To Ellen and Robert, it was the last place their son was seen alive. And behind its steel panels, they feared, was the secret no one dared to look for. 18 years would pass before anyone did. From the moment Michael was reported missing, the Turner family threw themselves into the search with a desperation that consumed every waking hour. Ellen called every hospital in Chicago, her voice shaking as she asked whether her son had been admitted. Robert drove aimlessly through neighborhoods at night, pulling over to tape missing person flyers to bus stops, gas stations, and convenience stores. The flyer was simple. Michael's school portrait, his age, the words, "Missing since April 2002. Within a week, his face was taped to storefront windows, fluttering on telephone poles, even pinned inside churches. At first, there was hope. Volunteers joined search parties, combing alleys and overgrown lots. News stations aired short segments about the missing Chicago student. Candlelight vigils lit up corners of the city where his friends gathered, holding photos and pleading for anyone with information to come forward. For a while, it felt like people were paying attention. But attention in a city like Chicago was fleeting. Other crimes, other tragedies, filled the headlines, and Michael's case slowly slid out of focus. Detectives tried in the beginning. They spoke to bartenders who'd seen him at the club, questioned taxi drivers who worked the area, knocked on doors near the intersection where the ATM stood. They traced his phone records, searched his bank card activity, and asked his friends the same questions again and again. But nothing useful surfaced. The ATM footage remained the only hard clue, and it raised more questions than it answered. It showed Michael walking toward the glowing machine at 1:40 a.m. He appeared clearly enough to be identified, but the tape cut off before showing him leave. When investigators checked the ATM logs, they found something else. At nearly the exact same time Michael appeared, the machine had been accessed by a technician from a contracted maintenance company. Robert latched onto that fact like a lifeline. He asked detectives again and again why the ATM needed servicing at nearly 2 in the morning. The answer was always the same. Overnight work was standard, scheduled to avoid daytime traffic. Still, the coincidence gnawed at him. Police interviewed the technician once. The man insisted he saw nothing unusual, that he had completed a routine job, locked up, and left. On paper, he was cleared. But when Ellen called the precinct for an update weeks later, she was told the technician had since moved out of Illinois. No one could say where he had gone. For the Turners, it felt like the only real lead had slipped through their hands. Ellen wrote letters to local officials, begged for more attention, and even contacted crime reporters directly. Some covered the case, but most politely declined. A missing 19-year-old in Chicago wasn't rare. Without evidence of foul play, Michael's file was just one among dozens. Meanwhile, their home was suffocating with absence. Michael's room stayed frozen in time, his sneakers lined neatly by the door, his notebook stacked on the desk, his jacket hanging over the chair. Ellen kept the bedroom door cracked open at night, whispering to herself that maybe he'd walk back through it. Robert buried his grief in silence, driving the same streets every night, staring at the ATM each time he passed it. The vigil candles burned lower with each passing week. Neighbors who had once joined in the search slowly returned to their routines. Posters curled in the rain, their ink fading. By the end of the summer, Michael's case was already slipping into the background noise of a city that never stopped moving. But for his parents, there was no moving on. They hired private investigators, scraping together savings to keep the search alive. One retired officer studied the files and told Robert something he would never forget. "If you ask me, the ATM is the key. Someone had access to that machine. Someone could have hidden something inside, and no one would ever know." The thought chilled him. Every day, strangers lined up to use that ATM. Teenagers withdrew cash for pizza, workers grabbed rent money, families pulled out grocery bills. All the while, the Turners wondered, had Michael been there all along, locked behind the steel panels of a machine people trusted with their savings? The city had already started to forget. But for Ellen and Robert, the glow of that ATM was no longer ordinary. It was a silent reminder that their son had walked into its light and never come back. And deep down, they feared it might be the very place holding the truth. By the time a year had passed, Michael Turner's name had already faded from the headlines. The vigils that once drew neighbors and strangers dwindled to a handful of close friends. The posters that had once covered every bus stop and storefront now hung weathered and torn, their ink blurred by rain and sun. In a city like Chicago, tragedy was never in short supply, and the cycle of violence and loss meant new names replaced the old. For most, Michael became just another missing face. For his family, the absence was inescapable. Ellen refused to touch his bedroom. His bed remained neatly made, his notebooks stacked on the desk, his sneakers lined in pairs along the wall. She dusted the room weekly, keeping it ready as though Michael might walk back in at any moment. Robert buried himself in long work shifts, but at night, he found himself driving the same streets, slowing every time he passed the corner of Belmont and Clark. He always looked at the ATM, glowing faintly under the streetlight. To strangers, it was a convenience. To Robert, it was a taunt. The police visits grew rare. Detectives rotated out of the missing persons unit, and each new investigator treated the case like a relic. Files were skimmed, boxes checked, but no new work was done. One detective even suggested Michael might have simply left town. Ellen's fury was instant. "My son didn't run away," she snapped. "He walked toward your ATM and vanished. You stopped looking before you even started." The ATM itself became a fixation. Records still showed it had been serviced the night Michael disappeared. The technician who performed that work had left Chicago within weeks and was never questioned again. When Ellen pressed for follow-up, she was told the lead had gone cold. The man had no known address. To police, that was the end of it. To the Turners, it was the one thread that should have been pulled. Life in their neighborhood moved forward, indifferent. Belmont and Clark was no stranger to crime. The area was known for petty thefts, drug deals, and fights that spilled out of bars after midnight. Garbage piled up near overflowing dumpsters, and the constant smell of fuel, cheap food, and rot lingered in the air. If anyone noticed an unusual odor from the ATM in those early months, they dismissed it as part of the background stench of a city corner that had always smelled that way. Over time, whatever trace there might have been disappeared as the remains inside dried, leaving nothing but silence behind steel panels. The machine continued its work. Every day, strangers lined up, sliding cards, punching keys, collecting their bills. Teenagers pulled out weekend cash. Workers grabbed rent money. Couples paid for late-night cabs. None of them had any reason to suspect that just inches away from the stacks of fresh bills lay the body of a 19-year-old who had vanished into thin air. Years passed. Michael's friends moved away, started families, built lives. His parents aged beneath the weight of not knowing. Holidays passed with an empty chair at the table. Birthdays came and went, with candles lit for someone who never blew them out. Ellen marked each year by taping a fresh flyer in the front window, though the photo never changed. She told herself as long as his face remained visible, his memory was alive. In 2007, 5 years after the disappearance, Michael's case was formally reclassified as cold. The word carried a cruel weight. Cold meant no active detectives, no new leads, no hope of progress unless something fell into their laps. For the Turners, it felt like their son had been abandoned, not only by the city, but by the very people who promised to find him. Yet the ATM remained. By 2010, its paint was chipped, its keypad worn smooth from thousands of hands. Its screen flickered occasionally, but it never failed to dispense cash. It stood there year after year, a silent monument to a mystery nobody wanted to confront. Ellen sometimes walked past it deliberately, staring at the glowing machine with the quiet conviction that it held the answer. Robert, too, slowed every time he drove by, though he rarely spoke of it. They both felt it. The truth was locked inside those panels. The city didn't care. Chicago was too loud, too fast, too consumed by its endless cycle of violence and survival to pause for one boy. But the Turners never let go. They carried the weight of their son's disappearance through every passing season, haunted by the thought that the machine everyone trusted had been holding him hostage all along. For 18 years, the ATM hummed quietly on its corner, serving thousands, its secret untouched. What no one realized was that it wasn't just a machine dispensing money. It was a tomb, hiding the answer to a mystery the city had already chosen to forget. And in October 2120, that secret was finally forced into the open. 18 years had passed. The year was 2120, and for most people in Chicago, the disappearance of Michael Turner was little more than a forgotten headline. For Ellen and Robert, it had never left. They had lived nearly 2 decades in limbo, marking time with birthdays uncelebrated and holidays incomplete, carrying the weight of silence. The city moved on. They did not. By then, the ATM at Belmont and Clark had grown old. Its paint was chipped, its keypad worn down to smooth metal, its screen flickering with age. Bank officials had already decided it was outdated. In October, a crew was scheduled to remove it and install a newer model. For the workers, it was just another routine job. Haul it away, strip it for parts, dispose of the shell. On a gray afternoon, the machine was unbolted from its concrete base and lifted onto a truck. Even before it was taken away, the crew noticed it felt unusually heavy, heavier than a typical unit. Someone joked that it must still be loaded with forgotten cash. Nobody laughed for long. When the ATM was delivered to a secure facility and dismantled, the workers expected wires, old components, maybe some stray bills. Instead, as the back panels came loose, they uncovered a bundle of decayed clothing. Jeans, a jacket, shoes still tied. What stopped them cold were the bones protruding through the fabric, unmistakable even in the dim light. For a moment, no one spoke. The air seemed to collapse into silence. Then one of the men dropped his wrench, muttered a curse, and staggered backward. Another whispered, "That's a body." Police were called immediately. Forensic teams arrived within hours. They worked methodically, photographing every angle, carefully removing the remains. Time had done its work. The body had dried, leaving little more than bone wrapped in fragments of clothing. Yet inside one pocket, a wallet survived. The ID card was weathered, but still legible. It read, Michael Turner. 18 years of questions collapsed into a single horrifying answer. The news broke fast. Local outlets carried the headline, "Remains found inside Chicago ATM." Reporters scrambled for details, repeating the same chilling fact. An ATM, used daily by hundreds of people, had been hiding the body of a missing teenager for nearly 2 decades. The horror wasn't just the discovery, but the thought of how many people had stood there, withdrawing cash, never knowing what was inches away. For Ellen, the phone call from police shattered what little strength she had left. She collapsed to the floor when she heard the words, sobbing uncontrollably. Robert sat frozen at the kitchen table, staring ahead, unable to comprehend that the machine he had passed 1,000 times had been holding their son all along. The neighborhood reacted with disbelief. Residents who had used the ATM countless times struggled with the idea that each transaction had taken place beside a tomb. Some said they remembered odd smells years earlier, but dismissed them as part of the neighborhood's constant haze of gasoline, fried food, and garbage. The reality was that in that corner of the city, unpleasant odors were background noise. No one had reason to connect them to the machine. Over time, the body inside had dried out, leaving no trace but silence. The police reopened the case, now with evidence that was impossible to ignore. The technician's name from 2002 resurfaced. He was the one who had serviced the ATM on the very night Michael disappeared. He was the one with full access to the hidden compartments where no ordinary employee would ever look. And he had left Chicago within weeks. But when investigators searched for him, they discovered he had died years earlier in another state. Whatever he might have known was buried with him. For the Turners, it was closure without justice. They finally knew where Michael had been, but not why or how. The machine that had continued dispensing cash for 18 years had been dispensing something else too, a silent horror hidden behind steel. Chicago recoiled at the story. It wasn't a remote forest or a dark riverbed. It wasn't an abandoned building on the edge of town. It was a machine everyone trusted, a machine people used daily. The thought that horror had been hiding inside something so ordinary was almost too much to comprehend. Michael Turner had finally been found, but the mystery of how he ended up in that ATM would remain, forever unanswered. The discovery of Michael Turner's body inside an ATM shocked the city. It wasn't just another crime story. It was the kind of revelation that stopped people in their tracks, made them look twice at the machines they passed every day. News anchors repeated the same chilling phrase again and again. His remains were found inside a functioning ATM. For Ellen and Robert, the phone call from detectives closed one chapter, but tore open another. 18 years of waiting were over. The limbo was gone. But the answer was worse than anything they had imagined. Their son hadn't wandered off, hadn't run away, hadn't built a new life somewhere far away. He had been there the entire time, locked behind steel, hidden in the one place no one thought to look. The police did what they could with what little remained. Forensic tests confirmed the identity. The condition of the body made it impossible to say how, exactly, Michael had died. But evidence suggested he had been in the machine since the very night he disappeared. His last steps on camera, his walk toward the ATM, were not followed by escape or accident. They ended there. Detectives reopened every report. Once again, one name rose to the top. The technician who had serviced the ATM that night. He had full access to the compartments, full knowledge of how the machine worked. He had moved away almost immediately after Michael's disappearance. Now, nearly 2 decades later, he was dead. Whatever answers he might have carried had vanished with him. Without him, the investigation could only speculate. One theory suggested Michael interrupted the technician during something he wasn't supposed to see. Tampering, theft, maybe even fraud. Another theory imagined an argument that turned deadly, with the machine itself becoming an improvised hiding place. There was even speculation that Michael had been targeted, though no one could explain why. None of the theories could be proven. For Ellen and Robert, the years of waiting ended in silence once again. They had their son back, but not the truth. Ellen told reporters through tears, "We walked past that machine every week. We begged them to check it. And all along, he was right there." Robert, usually quiet, stood beside her and said simply, "We were asking the wrong questions. We should have been asking what was inside, not what was outside." The neighborhood recoiled at the revelation. People admitted they had used the ATM countless times. Some remembered faint odors years earlier, but thought nothing of it. In a part of the city where garbage bins overflowed, where the air was always heavy with gasoline, fried food, and decay, no one questioned a smell that blended into the chaos of the streets. The machine kept working, kept dispensing bills, and no one ever imagined it was also guarding a secret. Michael Turner's case became more than just another cold file. It became a cautionary tale whispered in true crime podcasts, dissected on forums, repeated in hushed tones. The boy who vanished into a machine. A reminder that sometimes the darkest truths aren't buried in forests or rivers or abandoned basements. Sometimes they sit in plain sight, disguised as part of ordinary life. For the Turners, closure was bittersweet. They held a memorial service 18 years too late. Friends who had long since moved away returned to stand beside them. Strangers lit candles outside the old corner where the ATM once stood. But no service could answer the question that haunted them most. Why? That question remains. Michael Turner's story ends with a body pulled from the hollow of a machine everyone trusted. But the truth of how he ended up there and why is still unknown. And maybe that's the part that makes it hardest to let go. The thought that the real story of Michael Turner was never solved at all,